It was a grey morning in Brussels. The kind of morning that seemed designed for cold diplomacy rather than raw confrontation. The NATO headquarters gleamed with steel and glass, a monument to Western power, but inside, a very different energy was building. Delegations from across Africa had been invited to a high level NATO Africa Security Forum, ostensibly to discuss partnerships. What it became instead was a battlefield of words. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young and fiery leader of Burkina Faso, entered the hall with a calm determination. He wore no flamboyant medals, no polished arrogance. His uniform was simple, his gaze steady. Around him, generals and ministers whispered, many of them skeptical of why a man from a landlocked African nation with a modest military budget was sitting across from them as an equal. At the center of it all stood General Robert McAllister, a tall, broad-shouldered NATO officer from the United States, decorated, loud, and confident. He embodied everything Western military dominance projected, and he was about to unleash it. The first strike. The forum had barely begun when McAllister leaned forward into his microphone, his voice booming through the chamber. "Let's be honest here," he said, a smirk spreading across his face. "Burkina Faso has what? A military budget of $2 billion? That's barely enough to fuel our jets for a week. How do you expect to be taken seriously in modern warfare? NATO spends nearly $800 billion annually. That's what real power looks like." The room erupted in scattered laughter. Some European delegates chuckled openly. Others covered their mouths with polite smiles. The cameras caught the smirk of a French defense attaché, the quiet shaking heads of Italian officers, and the stifled grins of American staffers. The insult was not just directed at Burkina Faso, but at the entire African delegation present. General McAllister sat back in his chair, satisfied. He had struck the first blow. The message was clear. NATO was the giant, Africa the dwarf. Traoré's silence. But Traoré did not flinch. He sat calmly, adjusting the pen on his notepad, his face unreadable. His silence was louder than any outburst. Slowly, he raised his head and locked eyes with the general. "General," Traoré began, his voice low but steady, carrying across the hall with unexpected weight. "You measure strength in dollars. We measure strength in results. So, let us compare your $800 billion to our $2 billion, not in theory, but in practice." The laughter stopped. A ripple of curiosity spread across the audience. McAllister frowned, unprepared for a counterattack. Afghanistan, the trillion-dollar defeat. Traoré leaned forward. 20 years in Afghanistan. Over $2 trillion spent. Thousands of lives lost. And how did it end? He paused, letting the silence sharpen. The Taliban walked back into Kabul before your last helicopter even left. 20 years of occupation. And in the end, the people chose their own. That is not victory. That is humiliation. He held up a sheet of paper. Burkina Faso does not have $2 trillion to waste. But at least we do not fight wars for decades only, to be driven out by farmers with old rifles. The words cut deep. Cameras zoomed in on McAllister, whose jaw tightened. Delegates whispered furiously. Some Western journalists scribbled notes with widened eyes. Iraq, the $2 trillion chaos. And what of Iraq? Traoré continued, his voice rising slightly, gaining strength. $2 trillion again. You claimed to bring democracy. What did you bring instead? A fractured nation, millions of civilians dead, ISIS rising from the ashes. Tell me, General, where is the stability? Where is the victory? He tapped the microphone with a finger. $2 trillion. For chaos. Yet you laugh at $2 billion. At least our soldiers know what they are fighting for. Libya, a nation destroyed. He shifted his gaze toward the European delegation. Libya, he said firmly. Your jets bombed it into dust in 2011. You claimed you were protecting civilians. But what happened? Gaddafi was killed, yes. And since then, Libya has been nothing but warlords, slavery markets, and broken families. NATO destroyed a nation, and you call that success? The Italian minister lowered his head. The French attaché's smirk was gone. McAllister shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The F-35 disaster. But Traoré wasn't finished. He flipped another page in his notes, this time with a touch of irony in his smile. And let us not forget your toys. The F-35 program, your fifth-generation pride. $1.7 trillion in costs. A jet so expensive it could feed Africa for a century. And yet, it cannot even fly properly in the rain. The audience laughed, not at Traoré, but with him. Even some European journalists chuckled nervously, unable to deny the truth. Is this what you call efficiency? Is this what $800 billion buys? Dysfunctional weapons and endless wars. The African standard of strength. Traoré's tone grew deeper, more personal. General, our budget may be $2 billion, but every franc, every bullet, every drop of blood is spent with purpose. Our soldiers do not fight for contracts or corporations. They fight for their homes, for their families, for their ancestors who resisted colonialism. He stood, his uniform catching the light. We come from the lineage of Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Nelson Mandela. They had no billions, no endless fleets of tanks or jets. Yet they defeated empires. Strength is not in the wallet. It is in the will. The silent general. By now, the once smug McAllister had no words. He looked down, scribbled something meaningless on his pad, and avoided the cameras. The hall was buzzing, not with laughter this time, but with awe. African delegates sat taller, their faces glowing with pride. Even some NATO officers looked shaken. The viral storm. Within hours, clips of Traoré's speech exploded online. Hashtags trended across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Hashtag Traoré. Hashtag 2 billion beats 800 billion. Hashtag results over money. Headlines screamed across the globe. Burkina Faso's Traoré shreds NATO general in viral clash. $2 billion budget. $800 billion failures. African leader speaks truth. The speech NATO couldn't silence. Millions watched as Traoré dismantled the arrogance of an alliance that believed money equaled might. The final blow. At the close of the session, Traoré delivered his final words, steady and powerful. General, understand this. Military power is not measured by how much you spend. It is measured by what you achieve, by the will of your people to stand and fight, and by the justice of your cause. NATO has money, but Africa has heart. And in the end, heart wins wars. The room erupted in applause, this time, not polite or forced, but genuine. For the first time in decades, the arrogance of the West had been checked not with guns, not with missiles, but with words sharper than any weapon. And as Ibrahim Traoré walked out of the NATO headquarters, the world realized that Africa had found its voice. As the echoes of his words faded into the vast hall, silence lingered like a storm waiting to break. General McAllister shifted uneasily. His earlier arrogance dissolved into the stillness of the room. The man who had mocked a $2 billion budget now found himself staring down the raw truth of $800 billion worth of failure. Then, slowly at first, applause began. A single pair of hands clapped from the African delegation row. Then another. Then a wave of applause swept through the chamber. No longer restrained, no longer cautious. It grew into thunder, reverberating off the steel walls of NATO's headquarters. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. Delegates exchanged glances that carried more weight than words. And in the middle of it all, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood tall, not just as the leader of Burkina Faso, but as the embodiment of a principle, too often forgotten. That power lies not in budgets, but in belief. The applause carried into headlines the next morning. Africa's young lion shames NATO with truth. 2 billion versus 800 billion, the numbers that terrify the West. A speech that redefined global military arrogance. From Dakar to Johannesburg, from Bamako to Accra, screens lit up with clips of the moment. Children repeated Traoré's words in classrooms. Soldiers in dusty barracks whispered with pride that they were fighting for something money could never buy. Meanwhile, in Washington and Paris, officials held closed-door meetings, worried not about weapons or armies, but about something far more dangerous to their dominance, an idea. And the idea was this, that a nation's worth is not counted in dollars, but in dignity. Before leaving the hall, Traoré turned once more toward the cameras, his expression calm yet unyielding. History will not remember how much you spent, he said. It will remember what you stood for. Africa stands for freedom, and freedom has no price tag. With that, he walked out into the Brussels air, a leader who had just shifted the balance of power not with armies, but with undeniable truth. The world would never see NATO or Africa the same way again.